ladies, I think we should start, right? Because it's that time. And also with respect for those people that are online and join us from different parts of the world. Welcome everybody. I'm Maarten Botterman, and with me you may see a panel of Olivier Crepin-Leblond, my co-moderator from the Core Internet Values Dynamic Coalition, Wout de Natris, who coordinates the IS3C, the Internet Standards Coalition, and Thomas Schneider, who is currently chairman of the AI working group in the Council of Europe. And together we hope to interact with you to have a session to look at IoT and what good practice looks like towards the future. This is one of the workshops that will lead up to the IGF in Kyoto, where we hope to progress this overall, and we'll use the input from you. So you're very much invited to participate and to interact. For those here in the room, raise your hand is fine. For those in the Zoom room, we see you. So if you raise your hand, you'll get the word too. Basically, we'll go over section by section with a short Q&A per that section. And we hope to have the last half hour for a more interactive discussion or 25 minutes. So
a couple of additional points. So Olivier Crepin-Leblond speaking. So we've got an attendance sheet that for the people around the room to put their details on, and this is not to track you around afterwards, but to actually find out who was speaking at any one time. This is not a Chatham House rule, so everything that is being said is attributed. So you can introduce yourself also when you speak, and we'll be able to have a transcript that will reflect your views. It's the same also, I guess, for the people who are online. We have staff that are taking care of this at the moment. So if you wish to speak and you are online, use the usual Zoom system, and then we'll probably have to sort of play the cue between the people in the room and the people online. But I guess, yeah, let's get going. Let's go through the agenda. And
we've done it before. We've practiced for 3 years intensively, and now we have the pleasure of combining this with people in the room.
Just one more thing I wanted to say is why the two sessions are together, why the DC IoT and DC Core Internet Values have done this. And that's because we actually have a history already of the two DCs, the two dynamic coalitions working together in matters of common interest, which I could say. And it's very great to also see Wout now also joining on this. I don't know if that many DCs work together at the IGF. It might be the case. I know that some make good links with other DCs, but I just wanted to note that before we proceed forward. Thank you.
Yes, and core internet values, of course, also apply to the Internet of Things. And with that, we will have later on Alejandro Pejanti to present that, introduce that. So just a short overview to get us all on a kind of same starting point about the global trust in the Internet of Things. Internet of Things comes with benefits and challenges. And as we know, new technologies bring us new ways to respond to, but they also may come with dangers. And that doesn't mean we should ban them. People have tried that over the centuries. But yes, clean water pipes came in Paris. Cars are on the roads now. And we do need to have water quality control, and we need to have traffic control, and altogether we try to make sure that technologies, the best of it, is used. It's also clear we need IoT, Internet of Things, because the world is so intensively used that for many applications, this will be a necessity to make sure that we can watch the environment, support independent living, secure society, make better use of scarce resources, etc. At the same time, it comes with additional privacy challenges. You can imagine if your camera that is watching your house is also taking full control of the street, and it includes now facial recognition, that you have a full track of everybody there. Not everybody may appreciate that. So from that side, it's important to be conscious about how we use it. We believe in the dynamic coalition that it's really also important to address specific societal issues. We talk here about IoT and values related at global level, which means it's not about US level or Finnish or Dutch or French or English, but it's about what is important for all of us and to take that into account. For that, we need to speak with each other, listen to each other, and come to a way forward. There's many different applications. That's another way of thinking of it. So next to the regional different values one, it does matter whether the IoT device you talk about is part of a bigger ecosystem, for instance, that watches tsunamis to approach, or that it is something in the child's toy to interact with a kid, or in fact in a body, like sensing changes in the blood pressure, pre-warning for heart attacks and things like that. So you will understand that partly the chips in this may be the same, but also it's very much the context that determines how to deal with it. So what is the global approach? The IoT is merely an aspect of the internet, just like social networks and communication access to the information. But it does have specific characteristics. It stores, it collects, it stores information. It provides access to many data. And as you know, data is part of the big debate in the world of how we deal with that for the right reasons. One thing is we need data. The other thing is we need privacy. Autonomous networks with actuators. These are the IoT devices that take action following the specific data or actions from people using algorithms do things, and it's important to understand what they do and how they do it. And what we've seen increasingly is also the possibility to weaponize IoT devices to attack third parties, this for crime reasons or even in war circumstances. So important to realize that, recognize that, and deal with that in the best possible way. Dynamic Coalition is set up in 2008 in Hyderabad, and since 5 years, I think already we work together with core internet values, and I think IS3C is not 5 years old or 4.
3 years old. 3 years, yeah.
But we are willing to work with all that can add to the understanding, because it's not about monopolizing anything. It's about getting things done together, a world that is shaped. And yes, our focus is in IoT as part of a bigger world. So aim is at global good practice, specifically to the Internet of Things. The dialogue, and this goes for the other DCs as well. It's really, most dialogues take place in silos with single stakeholder groups like industry, like users, like whatever. But governments, we believe that multi-stakeholders need to meet on equal terms at global level, as at the IGF, also in the DC. Now, over the years, we came to Internet of Things good practice principle, and that is reflected here. The Internet of Things good practice aims at developing IoT systems, products, and services, taking ethical consideration into account by the outset, so by design, and both in development, deployment, and use during the life cycle to find an ethical, sustainable way ahead and help create a free, secure, and enabling rights-based environment. So basically, the future we want. The thinking in summary is that IoT embraces we embrace IoT to address societal challenges in an ethical way. We create an IT environment that encourages investments, because how can you benefit from all this if investments are not happening? And there's different factors that play a role there, ranging from legal clarity to stimulate awareness, feedback, etc. And last but not least, to ensure the emergence of a trusted IoT environment. And if you look above individual values and laws of different regions, then one thing that sticks out at global level, it comes back every time again, it's meaningful transparency. Transparency is not just showing everything, but showing it in a meaningful way. Clear accountability, so who in the chain of activities that goes from the chip to the experience has a responsibility. Real choice, so the stimulation indeed that you're not locked into one option only. And in the discussion we had earlier in DC, one thing was added that is not reflected here yet, but is that it's also important that users have some kind of control, and it's clear what user control is. So that's the thinking in summary. Clear element is so user-centric manipulation, as I mentioned. It's privacy, and it is also sustainability, because when we started with IoT devices, they were put out in the environment, and after some years, the next generation was just glued up on top of it, including on the battery and whatever. We now need to think in not only one time solutions, but in longer time solutions, because they're here to stay. So towards the future, we talk about the IoT regulatory and policy measures, and Wout will give an introduction about it. After that, we'll talk about the impact of artificial intelligence and machine learning on this environment, IoT and our ecological footprint, and deployment in the served regions. These are the subjects we talk about towards the IGF. But for now, this is the agenda for today. So with that, I'd love to, if there's any questions for clarity, please let us know. Otherwise, I'd love to start with the first speaker.
Just one quick housekeeping point. Are we allowing questions at the end of each section, or are we just opening the discussion, the dialogue completely at the end?
I think because each section is a bit separate, we should perhaps have a short dialogue
between the...
I think between in each session, just a question for clarification.
Correct, yeah.
And then the more time we have at the end, the better it is.
The wider dialogue at the end. Okay.
Yes. So I see no questions, no hands raised in the room or in the Zoom room. Wout, please.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Wout Natris, and I am a consultant based in the Netherlands on internet governance and cybersecurity. And one of the things that I do is coordinate the dynamic coalition of the Internet Governance Forum on Internet Standards, Security and Safety, or IS3C. We have a very clear mission, that is the rapid and widespread deployment on security-related internet standards and ICT best practices to make the internet more secure and safer. We work on this topic in working groups from different angles. Working group on education skills. We have one on procurement and supply chain management. We're working on a list of the most urgent internet standards and ICT best practices as a tool for governments and industry to work with. We're working on a narrative on DNSSEC and RPKI deployments to stimulate decision takers to get the right arguments to actually decide on deployment. We have come up with a working plan on emerging technologies like AI, the metaverse, etc. IS3C is around since the virtual IGF of 2020. That was when we inaugurated, and from there start working. And we published our first report on education and skills on the tertiary cybersecurity skill gap, basically in tertiary education at the IGF in Addis. And today I present on the upcoming report of our IoT Security by Design working group. This report is not finished, so I'm not guaranteeing that everything I say will be in the report for 100% like I'm presenting now, but this is the state of play. I'm presenting on behalf of Nicolas Fiumarelli, who, because of the time difference, is not able to join us online. So let's start out what we decided to do. We decided to compare all policy documents from governments that we were able to identify and compare the policies in them. So we identified around 30 policy and regulatory documents from 18 countries and regions, adding up to 21 in total. So for example, region, the European Union. And the researchers formulated 6 research questions. The first one is, what are the recommended best practices for setting out the responsibilities of all stakeholders involved in IoT security, including manufacturers, service providers, and users? The second question was, what policy and regulatory measures can be identified for promoting IoT security by design, specifically with regard to ensuring device resilience against crashes, power shortages, and outages? Third question, what policy and regulatory guidelines can be identified to promote user empowerment in IoT security? And what are the recommended best practices for implementing vulnerability disclosure mechanisms? The fourth question, through what mechanisms are regulators and policymakers enforcing compliance with established IoT security standards and encouraging manufacturers to adopt the recommended best practices? The fifth question, how do policy and regulatory documents relate security updates with warranty policies for IoT devices and services? And the final question, how are policy and regulatory documents addressing the global adoption of standardized IoT security standards, and what measures are being taken to promote the implementation of these standards in the IoT security? So that's a lot of questions, and we started to compare the policies. And we came up with a total of 442, what we then call not best, but these good practices in all these documents. So that means that there are 442 pieces of advice or guidance given to the people manufacturing and designing IoT. And they're not spread out even over all these documents. So the research brought to light best practices and they brought to light shortcomings. And let me start by adding some of these up. So most countries and almost the whole global south lack a framework of any kind. So if we look at the countries that we did manage to identify, a lot of them from Western Europe and the EU, usually they're sort of the same. Because of that, we found we're in the UK, in Canada, in United States, in Singapore, South Korea, Australia, and Egypt, if I remember correctly, and India. So as I said, there were 442 practices identified in these 30 documents, but many do not match other countries' policies. There's also a difference in taxonomy. So I don't have an example ready, but if something means something else in another country, then how is it possible to have the same sort of practice when you're designing IoT? And this is worrying with all these differences because IoT is everywhere. So how can you regulate or even try to establish any form of oversight if you not even on the same page. There's also absolutely no consequences in these documents towards deployment. So the documents are a guidance, but they're voluntary. And our working group 3 on procurement and on supply chain management shows that governments seldom procure demanding security by design. So they demand security, but they are not procuring security. At least we have not found that, except in the Netherlands. The standards on which the internet runs are not seen as standards by governments. If you look at the policies, they don't mention the internet standards. They mention official standards made by government bodies, but that's not what the internet runs on. And finally, laying a link between security flaws and integrity is a strong advocate for security updates, something which is not always demanded as well. What the researchers did, they divided the 442 good practices into 4 main categories. One is privacy protection, the other is secure updating processes or practices, user empowerment practices, and operational resilience practices. With all come a set of recommendations. So for example, ideally lifecycle updates are mandatory, but at a minimum, think about the warranty period, but set some sort of a date on which you have to provide security updates. What about demanding responsible disclosure schemes? Because they bring to light the flaws. So how do we arrange that as a world that these testings are becoming formal, more or less, and there's a process to handle them? What about testing principles before IoT comes to market? So if testing principles must be adhered to because of a procurement process, it will get part of the designing of IoT and the manufacturing of IoT. Security measures, for example, encryption to prevent access and data loss, and training and awareness schemes for end users. So adopting a comprehensive security by design approach ensures the resilience and integrity of our interconnected world, making it imperative for organizations to prioritize security measures and incorporate them into the core design of their IoT systems. So once the demand for security comes, that is the moment that it becomes security by design. Because we're looking at policy. The policy is not security by design, it's a sort of guideline to get to the process of security by design. So what is the easy way out? Well, everybody would say is legislation and enforcement. But on the other hand, this is not the favored way to go, as legislation is always behind and may even stifle innovation and perhaps even production if the taxonomy doesn't even add up. What would you adhere to as a manufacturer? In the past, voluntary deployment seems to be equal to no deployment, and that is something that has to be changed. How can that be altered? Well, I developed the idea of pressure points in society. So where are the points in society that would actually make the company procure or so the design secure by design? So moving forward, the emphasis of this strategy is promoting faster and widespread deployment of IoT security measures. And this IS3C's aim to transform the identified best practices from optional guidelines to deployable standards based on uniformity and security protocols across all jurisdictions. So potential ways to achieve this, and it is not a limited list, it could be a lot more larger, but just to provide some thoughts. The internet in many parts of the world is not owned by governments. And internet standards and ICT best practices, industry policies on abuse, etc., are not made and set by governments. So governments are advised to accept these standards that the industry makes and the best practices they make for what they are, a part of the core of the internet and ICT, and work from there. It makes little sense not to recognize and accept the security standards and then demand security. Currently, they are hardly, if at all, mentioned in policy documents on ICT or IoT security. And this must change if IoT and the internet are to become secure by design. 2, practice what you preach. When procuring or purchasing IoT and ICT, governments and larger organizations must demand security by design, including set standards and best practices, and accept the cost. Because only then it will be built into the product or service. 3, when all countries or regions start to legislate without coordination, what will be regulated and enforced? If there is no coordination or agreement on standards to enforce, a myriad of rules would have to be adhered to by manufacturers, and it will at minimum hamper innovation and perhaps even stop production. ICC advises that coordination is applied by governments when they start to discuss enforcement. And 4, that also goes for the taxonomy. Agree upon what it means. 5th, a good idea would be to start labeling schemes, but also to coordinate to make them uniform and work with consumer advocacy organizations so they include the outcome when testing IoT devices and devices containing IoT. So when a consumer advocacy organization tests for refrigerators with an IoT component, test the IoT component on security and not just whether the light works and how the fridge does this work. 6, having no regulation currently seems to equal no deployment by industry. Now, this has to change. If legislation is undesirable, then pressure has to come from other sources in society. Procurement by governments and large organizations is one such source. It will filter out all products and services that do not deliver security by design. And this will most likely lead to higher security for all end users. But so why make 2 products, one for governments and one for us as a private individual? Consumer and privacy protection organizations must establish when insecure devices, applications, or services harm consumers or end users, and act upon it towards the sellers and manufacturers of said products, because they usually have the tools. You have the GDPR, they have the duty of care rules already in hand. So if they break that sort of legislation, IoT, then you have all sorts of laws already available to work with, and they don't at this moment. 8 is make standards and part of cybersecurity tertiary education to build aware future workforce. Because if our children don't learn about these sort of standards in education, and I'm told that usually they're not, how do you expect to build secure by design devices when they get into the workforce? 2 more, Martin. No matter how cheap, all IoT can be used to attack others and debilitate society. So there should be no exception for the cheapest chip made on Earth. If security is applied there, if they make them by the million, how much expensive would it become? 1 cent, 2 cents? So what are we talking about? 10, when all else fails, legislation and enforcement remains the only option to make IoT and ICT more secure and safer. But as I tried to explain, there are so many other ways that we may be able to achieve this, but we have to work together. This is not a single organization issue. And if we don't recognize that, then we're bound to fail, and governments will probably step in at some point. But I think that that is about where we are aiming for. And as we see, there's a lot of work to be done here. I can't tell you when the report is finished because we're working hard at it, but I hope that it is before the summer holidays.
Okay, that was question number 1 on my question, so that's answered already. Thank you for that insight in the research that you've done. I think useful, I think recognizable. It's also a clear component to other discussions we've had. So you see, if it's discussed in different fora, that adds value too, in terms of what you said. Any questions for clarifications on this? And I'm also looking in the Zoom room. And thanks, Jonathan, for the insights that you shared on principles-based legislation. I hear a voice, but I don't see who it is.
It was a recording in progress.
It was recording in progress, so thank you, recorder.
It's a device that wanted to speak, basically.
And appreciate the duty of care approach summary, as Wout said. I think, thank you for the intro. I think we'll go deeper into the discussion about the power of procurement, the need for taxonomy, and also the do it together element, and the duty of care, which is basically for every player in the value chain, right? Right. So with that, I'd love to move towards the following presentation, which is from Alejandro, a companion from the Core Internet Values group, on what core internet values relate to IoT. And
Alejandro is going to present remotely, and I think he's going to be able to share his screen. So it's you can see him, but he'll also, Alejandro, you're going to have to share your screen if you want to.
And you can, yes.
And hopefully we can hear you in the room. That's the other test.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Perfect.
Perfect.
Good morning in Finland, elsewhere where it's day starting, and afternoon. Some of you I see are in deep time zones, early in the morning or very late in the midnight. Thanks, Martin and Olivier, for setting up this session and for inviting me. I will speak very briefly about the core internet values and some work that is derived from it. Apologies for the lighting here. Since I'm traveling, I don't have full control. The Core Internet Values Dynamic Coalition was founded in 2009 in the IGF in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And wow, has the world changed since then, I mean, starting with the government of Egypt and the role the internet had in that change. And all the back and forth and backlash, anti-backlash that has been swinging the pendulum since then. So the Core Internet Values Dynamic Coalition was founded by several of us after an initiative and speech in that forum from Lynn Santamore. We had organized a session, and this has been a continued concern. The subject of that session is people who approach the internet, let's say from the outside, or who are recent users. The many stakeholders that Wout and Martin have already mentioned, coming from governments and civil society and other places, and business, of course, who want to fix something in the internet that displeases them, that's occasionally something really ill. And by fixing it, it would turn out that we would actually not even have the same internet as before, or not an internet at all. Many of the first privacy enhancement initiatives, for example, would have blocked out large swathes of the internet from others. So this is a continuing effort to understand how to keep these core values of the internet. And of course, there's a discussion about which are these core values. There are several layers to that discussion as well. It's possible to agree, at least partially, that the very core values of the internet are those that were embedded in its design. These were the let me put this into full screen. So that would be the layered architecture, which also implies to avoid as much as possible layer crossings. Layer violations are significant, should have a very significant reason to do them and a penalty otherwise. Packet switching, the separation between TCP/IP. Best effort in interviews with Windsurf and others. I've found repeatedly that while we usually speak about interoperability as a core value of the internet, it's actually best effort that was the main driving principle when he and Bob Kahn were designing TCP/IP for the generalized packet radio service, embracing the fallibility of the links and nodes of a radio network. And this continues to shape the internet up to today. Interoperability, openness, the robustness principle of Fortell, being conservative in what you do, and liberal in what you accept from others, which also maps very well to some social practices like not responding to every single unpleasant WhatsApp message or earlier email messages and engaging flame wars. Then the end-to-end principle, who puts the intelligence at the edge, decentralization. Then these are more objectives than principles, scalability and resilience, and the result of all this, which is permissionless innovation. This statement also requires explaining to government people, especially, that this does not mean that the internet is a lawless frontier, new Wild West and so forth, because actually whatever is done on the internet is being done in some jurisdiction. And what happens, of course, with internet is where it disrupts is before the way it works, that applying these principles may make it really hard to find out and enforce who is doing what and breaking some rules. The Internet Society later on, a couple of years ago in 2017, 18, also looked at what are the principal characteristics that shouldn't be altered on the internet, whatever you do. And these are global reach and integrity, a general purpose network, permissionless innovation, being it accessible for everyone in the world, interoperability and mutual agreement, this mantra that the internet runs on a handshake, collaboration, reusable blocks, and that the network itself doesn't create a permanent favorite. And the ISO created a toolkit to make an internet impact assessment, sort of like you do in some countries by law. You have to do an environmental impact assessment if you start building a hotel on the beach or a dam in the mountains, or competition impact assessments, which are done in some other countries. And it applies in a systematic way, these things. Apnic and Lacnic asked in a project for what are the internet success factors, scalability, flexibility, resilience. And there's a description of 4 ways to handle the internet from national governments in a very interesting book by Kieran O'Hara and Dame Wendy Ho. I've developed from the work of the network. This is not the work of the CIV, but of the Dynamic Coalition, but my own contribution derived from this, which says how to map some things we know, like phishing, or nice things like Wikipedia, through scale, internet scale, identity management and anonymity, trans or cross-jurisdictional factors, which tell you how so people arbitrage the law or the differences in laws in different countries to do cybercrime, but also how this helps, for example, to foster education in repressive regimes, whistleblowing, and so forth. Barrier lowering, information of organizations and the access to markets, friction reduction as speedy ways to do things, which are also sometimes very awful, and you actually want to introduce some friction, like, for example, make it difficult to make bank transfers, which could lead to losing your heritage in phishing, and memory and oblivion. You can further, more recent tools are these governance triangles from Abbott and Snyder, which in each vertex has states, civil society, and firms, and classifies different governance mechanisms within this triangle as whether they have more weight from one or more of these parties. And this has been applied by Gorba to platform governance. We can use these things as a sieve, like we do for sifting grains, say stones, gravel, and sand, so that we apply these successive frameworks to different initiatives, law initiatives, and so forth, to screen for where they collide with the internet principles or their forms of applying them. When we look at the Internet of Things, this tool is valuable. We haven't made a full application of it, let's say full rigorous application of it. But we can see, for example, that the IoT, as Martin has said, is basically, in a caricatural way, we can say that it is a set of sensors and actuators mediated by the cloud. Some of them are using the open internet, not all of them. Many of them are using LoRa, LoRaWAN, internal networks, overlay networks, and so forth. But especially consumer IoT, of course, is using the open internet. You don't hire a dedicated fiber optic link to run your Apple Watch. You do that over the open internet. And there's a mixture of these things that are becoming really extremely complex. And that's where the standards and the dynamic coalition internet standards come in. They are very much ignored by governments and by consumers. One of the risks that you have here is that with the very good work of both dynamic coalitions, which I am a member and follow with great leadership, as has been seen, is that consumers will still buy the cheapest stuff that comes from wherever, from outside their jurisdiction, or even import it informally into the country by buying it abroad and bringing it as luggage. And then, of course, open a huge attack surface that no one knows about. And that's unmanageable because these devices are too lightweight to even be able to update their operating systems or application software. And they will be in the network for 5 or 10 years without anyone's ability to isolate or force their management. So the concern for the core internet values dynamic coalition is whether these uses of the internet and the overlay networks will actually hamper interoperability, whether they will put too much strain on the best effort principle or others, as have been seen. I would like to stop here in order to leave room for other speakers and for questions. Thank you very much. I hope this is understandable and useful. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Indeed, yes. I hope this has provided some kind of a sense of how it all fits together and how the topics that we're dealing with are very much complementary to each other in this sense. I think we can, in the interest of time, I don't know if anybody, okay, please, a couple of questions.
Thank you, Roberto Gaetano, EuroDIG. I have a question that is actually very much recurring. I'm making a reference to a couple of lines in one slide. One is that this is not the Wild West, and the other one was John Postel's statement about being liberal in what we accept and being conservative in what we say. I just observed that the internet, the way we look at, we take the risk of concentrating on what the traditional internet is and forgetting that there's the social media and there's all these new tools that are becoming much more close to the Wild West than our good old traditional internet. I just want to quote one thing. In Italy, there was in Rome a couple of days ago, one 5-year-old boy was killed in a crash by a YouTuber that rented a Maserati to run like hell in the city, and that ended up in having a crash. And that was the only purpose was to do this YouTube, and behind this there are commercial interests, because even the guy who was renting the cars was involved with publicity and so on. I mean, this some part of the internet more linked with the social media are becoming, as a matter of fact, the Wild West. And is there any way that we can bring our basic principle also to this world that is the one that is affecting more and more the young generation and is the future? So I have a big question. The internet is much more than what we have been living in the last 20 years. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a point that we would go deeper in the general discussion, because no doubt Thomas will touch upon that as well. And Wout did so as well in his introduction, when he said, well, how do we empower this? There will always be stupid people, that's one thing. But at the same time, there's also good principles that we recognize. And how they're empowered is not clear. So I think that's a good point of discussion.
Yeah, Alejandro wanted to say a couple of words, but I just wanted to add one thing, and we haven't spoken about it here. It's of course the layered architecture of the internet. What is the internet? Is it this whole thing, including the applications of which some of them have dramatic consequences? Are we speaking purely of the technological part of it? This is an ongoing discussion because you can go as far or as small as you want. And sometimes we're talking in parallel or maybe across each other rather than on the exact topic itself.
But how do you?
Yeah. I forgot to mention that EuroDIG sees things from the point of view of the users, and from the user's point of view, the distinction about the different layers is much more blurred.
Yes, I get that. Alejandro, I'd love to ask you to.
Very briefly, Roberto, I don't think that this is essentially an internet issue. It's an issue with social uses of the internet. As Olivia says, this is a layer thing, and this is a very clearly layer 8 or layer 10 thing. What happened with this boy could have happened in a society with tabloids, not even television, where the big difference here, of course, is the scaling and ease of access for someone trying to make themselves notorious. But it's not purely an internet issue. If you didn't have an internet, this could have happened anyway, only probably not at the same scale. Not across so many countries and so forth. That's what the 6F framework tries to tell you, to help you do. Separate the human and social motivations and the way things are being done from the disruptive way that the internet is altering them. So you could act on the internet, but you would still have this guy's ambition to be recognized, causing him to cause this damage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alejandro, can we link your presentation as well from the EuroDIG site? So it becomes
We'll do that.
Body. Super. Andre, do you have a question on this, or can we keep that for the discussion? Because
Alejandro and Wout actually mentioned a few things about IoT that I wanted to just make a quick comment and then suggest a question to answer related specifically also to AI.
Yeah, because we're linking into AI clearly now as well. I saw that. If you open your microphone on your computer, then we'll hear you even better.
Okay. So the question, can you?
I think it picks him up, yeah.
Testing.
So the question is this. Both of you mentioned a few things about openness in terms of IoT devices, etc. Question is that's not an end user issue. An end user usually doesn't care about openness, about standards, etc., because they don't see this as an end user problem. They just want some functionality, and if that functionality exists, it works. Now, in terms of openness, it's not really an issue. In terms of interoperability, it already is an issue for the user. Because if the user has an object and he wants to interact that object with a different object, then it needs interoperability, so it's a market thing. If it works together, they will probably buy it. A few other things like new functionality and specifically relating to updates, they will want to update with new functionality. That makes sense because they will get something extra out of the updates. They don't care about things like security and privacy when it relates to updates, because they don't see that as an advantage. They just see that as something, oh, I have to do Windows update or Linux update or Mac update, something like that. For them, it's just a boring thing that they have to do. They don't see the value in it. And all of these put together, at least in my opinion, is related to education. If people understand the needs for these kind of things, this was mentioned before, of course, if they understand the need for this, it becomes relevant. Now, coming back to a specific point, which is demanding that standards exist, demanding that there is a well-defined set of things, including security and privacy, that need to go into an IoT device. And I can expand beyond IoT devices, of course. In that case, it would be useful, but where does it go? Because there is another problem. If we force too much privacy into things, and we've been seeing that this year specifically. If we force too much standards, in fact, we actually impede technology and innovation, because one thing prevents the other. Now, the question that I have, just to close this up, is what about AI? So when AI comes into play with all of this, because it's now coming into force big time since the beginning of the year, at least, I'm not going to mention before, what happens to the standards that's not IoT in general, but specifically, not AI in general, but IoT specifically will have to do, because suddenly IoT was a wild west, as Roberto mentioned, and suddenly with AI, it's highly regulated, or it has to be highly regulated. So how does that work? And this is maybe an active question for you.
This is exactly why we invited Thomas to be here, and good to be here.
It's a very good introduction to Thomas's section.
And I also want to refer to what Jonathan Cave says, that what is true is that people are influenced by IoT as well as by social media like YouTube, Facebook, whatever. And that the interaction of IoT devices is also a form of social media, because you can even follow cameras anywhere, for instance. So yeah, AI and LLM are not new, I would say. I also would dare to say it's not fully regulated yet either. But there's a lot of discussion on it, and Thomas is in the middle of that with the discussions at the Council of Europe. So great if you could share your light on what of this is specifically important for the domain we talk about, which is this subset or this part of the internet that is IoT, as these are the hand and feet and the eyes and ears of AI and internet, I would say. Thomas?
Yes, thank you, Martin, and hello, everybody. My name is Thomas. I work for the Swiss government for about 20 years in digital governance, and for the time being, I have this other additional job that has been mentioned. So I chair the Council of Europe's work on the first binding international convention on AI that is currently going on. Well, let me and I'm not a technician and I'm not a lawyer. I'm an economist and a historian, so that may give you a little bit of an idea that I try to look at things sometimes from a slightly different perspective than of course, some other people. And if we look a step back, and the number of questions that we've heard are not new, and you can apply them to all kinds of technologies. So I remember about 15 years ago, IoT was the big thing in all the EU presidency, digital assemblies, or whatever they were called at that time. Then we had the big data as the big issue for about 5 years, and then it was AI, and the rest has now slightly disappeared. But as it has already been mentioned, you don't manage data without AI. You need devices that produce data, and you need AI to, the other way around, AI is worth nothing if you don't have data. So everything is, of course, connected to everything. Which makes the whole thing fancy, but also, of course, a little bit complicated, because you need to nevertheless try and somehow develop a system on how to understand the different components. What I'm trying to say is that, and of course, now the attention is on AI. In my national parliament, we are getting about 5 to 10 questions and requests per week that we have to answer. They're normally very strongly overlapping, and I'm giving quite a lot of interviews currently. And one of the things that I actually realized is that while for years people talk about data as the new oil and draw the parallels, but also make the differences, nobody or few people are talking about AI systems as the new engines that do basically the same.
Oil.
Do the same with oil and data, like what engines used to do. And if you look at where we were now about 100 to 120 years ago, where we had engines in machines that were producing goods or manufacturing stuff, that were, or engines that were moving from A to B, be it on land, in water, or in the air, then nobody was asking for, like it is now the case in many areas, with AI or with IoT, whatever, for the one regulation that solves all the problems. There is no engine law, no single one engine law. There are hundreds and hundreds of regulations of norms for engines, but many more actually for the machines that the engines are a part of, be it machines that produce something or machines that move from one to B, and there are equally many regulatory frameworks for the people that use these engines, that drive them, that sit in them, that are affected by them. So it is hundreds, probably even thousands of technical standards, of legal standards, but also of societal and cultural norms actually that differ from culture to culture, that shape the use of these tools. And you can actually watch exactly the same thing with AI, data, or IoT, or whatever element or part you pick out from this, let's say, digital transformation that is comparable to what the first industrial revolution did, in particular, not only automating repetitive manual work of men, now we're automating repetitive cognitive work of men through AI, data, and so on and so forth. There are other aspects like the media and contact aspect, of course, that is in the tradition of inventing the printing press, inventing radio, television, inventing the internet, and so on and so forth. But basically, these are the key elements. And so I think it makes sense to look at how our norm system works, how we have developed it, and you can use the engine, the 200 years of experience with the engine, you can use it. We have the same regulation maybe in the airplane business on how an engine needs to be tested, or an airplane needs to be tested that it's allowed to fly. We have some harmonization with the infrastructure, with the way people are driving it, with airports. If you look at engines in cars, you may have some harmonization, some rules on the cars themselves, but you may have different exhaust emission rules per countries. You definitely have different rules for the drivers. We have different per mil percent alcohol rates from country to country sometimes, but also it even depends whether you're transporting goods in a car or whether you're transporting people. Maybe there you need to be more serious than with goods, animals maybe somewhere in between, and so on and so forth. The people on the island in the north of Europe drive still on another side than the rest, and their cars are built slightly different, but they can drive over here because there's some rules that work nevertheless. So it depends on the application of these tools that shape the set of rules that are applicable, and that is influenced again also by historic reasons and by cultural attitudes. We are not all people have the same degree of risk averseness versus risk friendliness. That depends from culture to culture. In Germany, they still drive in some areas without speed limits. That also has a psychological meaning for selling their cars, of course. So it's not. So again, it gets very, very sophisticated if you go into detail. And we're about to do the same with AI, but it will take us also decades, probably also centuries, to come up with a set of rules that make sense, that develops as the technology develops, that goes for specific applications of IoT, for social media, and so on and so forth. Like it took us 200 years to develop a system that regulates engines in machines. And we have managed to be very specific about alcohol per mil limits with drivers, but we still haven't managed to solve the biggest problem, AI, that machines that burn CO2 are basically killing us and our planet. So we're working on this for at least 100 years without having found a solution. So also there you see, we'll not find solutions to all problems immediately. We'll probably tackle the more isolated, smaller problems first and try to ignore the big problems that the digital transformation will generate. But that's the way humans work. So what we are doing at the Council of Europe is trying to contribute one element to this plethora of set of norms that is needed. And this is something that, of course, builds on what we already have. And this is also important, that with every new technology that emerges, this is not just there in the vacuum. You have legal norms, you have technical norms, you have cultural norms that apply to every new technology, to every new use. We have at the Council of Europe's role is basically to provide for a legal framework that allows citizens to have their human rights protected, that gives some guidance about democracy and rule of law. The EU that is working on a national, if you consider the EU as one legislation, one jurisdiction on a national law to implement the rules for businesses or for users of AI. At the Council of Europe, we are developing a binding treaty among states that should agree on a number of fundamental principles that should apply to AI. And if you look at these principles, they are not fundamentally different from principles that apply to all technologies. But then, of course, there's a delta. The delta is there's some things that you can take the Human Rights Convention and the 250 other conventions and the thousands of soft law. Many things are just the same with AI, like with other technologies or with internet, just like as the offline world, hence the famous quote, whatever is legal online, offline should also be legal offline, and whatever is unlegal online should be, and the other way around. You know what I'm referring to. So, but there is a delta. For instance, if you talk about a right to a fair trial, of course, with AI, you may need to define whether that means that if an AI system takes a decision in the judicial system about how much social aid you get, or whether somebody that committed a crime, what the ratio of fallback is with him, how much you sentence that person, how you predict its future. What is not clear currently is whether it is okay if a machine takes that decision, or at what extent you need to have a human person that takes responsibility. And if you go for a recourse on something where a decision has been taken, or at least clearly prepared by a machine, whether you have the right to have a human to talk to, or whether that can be in the future, another AI system that will look at your case and decide over it. So these are things that are not clarified in the existing regulation, where we will need a clarification. And this is one of the elements, or transparency and accountability. What does it mean to be, everybody agrees that we need to be, whatever we do and whatever machines do need to be transparent and traceable and understandable. But what does this mean in the context of AI? Where do you have to have a right to look at the algorithm? Do you need just some criteria that need to be fulfilled? And so on and so forth. So it gets quite tricky if you go into the technical detail about what transparency means. But what it is clear is that we need transparency. We also need liability. This is one of the key things, I guess, with regard to security and IoT. If whoever is producing these devices, or if whoever is selling these devices, and if whoever is using these devices are at least partially liable for the damage and for the risk, then you will get the norms will come fairly quickly, because this is normally what makes in particular companies trigger if they want to know what the potential risk, what the potential cost factors are. If this is unclear, they may think they escape. If it is clear who's liable, then normally that creates an incentive for regulation to emerge. So again, what we are trying to do at the Council of Europe is providing guidance on the level of fundamental principles that are based on 70 years of standards in human rights, democracy, and rule of law. But this is just one element that is needed. The EU, in its jurisdiction, is applying this already, not trying to apply this in a particular piece of legislation. The US, the UK, my country, Israel, others are preparing the same. But that's again just one piece of the puzzle. At the same time, you have the standardization institutions from ISO on a global level to Sensenelec and others in European level that are developing standards for AI, for other things that should also be compatible with the legal requirements. And then again, the social component is maybe a little less crucial on IoT than, depending on how you define it, than on social media. For instance, you may not have one platform regulation law, and you realize this also at the UNESCO process that is trying to give guidance on a global level on how to deal with platforms that deal with content. That is very, very difficult, because you have completely different ways of dealing with freedom of expression and with control and so on and so forth. Whereas the more technical it gets, the easier it gets. And IoT devices may be somewhere, the most of them at least on the more technical side, but as you say, it depends on how you define it. I'll stop here. But I think the parallel, of course, is obvious. You need to have rules. They need to make sense. They need to be problem, and so they need to understand the problem and try to create a solution and not create new problems, i.e. not hinder innovation. And they need to be appropriate to the risks and to the expectation that people have on how these risks should be dealt with. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Thomas, for that. You asked about how it depends how you define IoT. I think if we talk here about IoT, it's devices, systems, and services. And as soon as you go to systems and services, it involves increasingly AI or machine learning, at least the application of algorithms of how to deal with data. And I think much of what you said, it's about transparency, it's about liability assignment. Is I think generally true. So really appreciate that. Yeah, do AI systems have a legal persona? That's one of the things that's not clear yet, I would say. The liability is that. So I think with all this, we've got a good sketch of what IoT does, good things, bad things, how you use it, what values to be taken into account that are generally true for the internet, how AI kicks in and in a way does adds to the debate. Because if you talk, you mentioned IoT devices, some of them are fairly technical and can be described in technical terms, others less so. I think the big difference between the auto engine or the engines that did the machines, you can define the screws and bolts, and they remain the same, but they wear out slowly over time. AI is something that is informed by data and then changes the way it acts or reacts on things over time. So the dynamism changes enormously. With that, I'd love to invite questions on these topics as a whole from anybody. I saw some interesting discussions in the chat. And please raise your hand if you want to.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one thing that has struck me. It's Olivier Kaplan speaking. Whilst people gather their thoughts about questions and their own comments, but one thing that struck me when Thomas was doing his presentation was he told us it took about 100 years for us to understand the whole implication of machines and etc. I hope it doesn't take us 100 years to deal with AI. I'm not sure how long you want to run that project in the European Union, but one
Council of Europe.
Sorry?
The Council of
The Council of Europe, yeah. The one thing that did strike me, though, is the complexity of things. The internet introduced a whole number of huge complexity when it came down to whether liability or, we were speaking about earlier, the consequences of its use. And then, of course, the IoT went on top of that, and that introduces some more complexity. And now AI also introduces even further complexity. And when we're speaking about liability and whether an AI system has a legal persona or not, you are now dealing with challenges which are not making things any simpler, but appear to be making things even more complex, with more pitfalls, with more chances of very strong-handed regulation that will just say, oh, if we regulate all of this really strongly, from the internet all the way up to AI, then we will have a safer world. And I'm rather concerned about this. And I think that many of us are, because the whole mixing of all these topics together and using this as a means of, let's have more control so as to ensure more safety for people is something that is of great concern to me.
Thanks for that.
I would like to respond to Thomas a little bit.
And then Andre.
Walter Natris on the panel. About 20 years ago, I had to study why telecommunications cables in the Netherlands were allowed to be put into the ground without having to pay anything to the government. And it turned out that I had to dig up legislation from 1904 to actually be able to get to the gist of it. And then I found that that was based on even telegraph laws from before that. And that they had copied from all sorts of countries where they had set up the rules basically for telecommunication cables. So I think that that is a sort of a parallel to where we are in at this moment, perhaps. And that could be some sort of a hold on how to actually regulate, if we're going to regulate anything on the internet. Because they were able to do that 150 years ago already. So in other words, there are parallels to be found. I think the other thing, responding to Olivier, is that what we're working on with IS3C is not about getting 100% protection for everything, because that's impossible. But standards have been made that will make at least the low-hanging fruit disappear. And if we manage as an internet world to deploy these standards that have been made by your own community, then the world will be safer because of that. And yes, we can't protect everybody from everything, but we can't do that on the road, and we can't do that, unfortunately, with Maseratis and YouTubers. There's a lot of things that will disappear if we only manage to deal with what we've created ourselves to make ourselves safer. And that's the limit where we will go. And we're not advocating enforcement, as you notice. We're advocating to do that by buying secure, educating people, explaining to them why it's important to update. And that's where all sort of different players come in. That's why I mentioned consumer advocates, protection, privacy protection, et cetera, et cetera. They may all have a role to play that is not being played sufficiently at this point in time.
I think that's a very good point. And just to go back to the cars, it was only after 100 years, well, no, after more than 50 years, that seatbelts became obligatory around the world. And I still remember some people who said, well, it's only obligatory tomorrow, so today we can drive without it. And the neighbors behind living close by, actually on that night, they died because they hit another car. So it's a combination of common sense, adoption, and legislation. Yes, all have a role there. Thank you for doing that. If you look to the internet today, one of the things is you can be spoofed. You can be confused by messages from otherwise. One of the measures that helps there is DNSSEC. That is a standard that makes sure that at least you have contact with that email address. It's voluntary. And you see how much time it takes for that. This common sense measure that doesn't cost a lot penetrates the internet. So just two points of illustration. Andre, please.
Thank you. So Bob was actually mentioning about standards, some of them are quite old. And this is good because this goes into what I wanted to mention. So there are countries and different industries, not necessarily IoT, that have very strict regulations. Let's say bank has very strict regulations. Nowadays, the bank wants to go into the cloud because it's more efficient. Everyone is doing it. It is being proven to be more secure than on premises, but they cannot because of legal limitations and so on. On the other hand, you have industries and countries that are completely unregulated. And there are advantages and disadvantages for both. Okay, so one of the things I'm reading here from Jonathan K. from the comments I wanted to mention is he's talking about the right levels of standards and norms, and finding them might be tricky. So the problem here is not so much to have more or less standards, because the extremes will be very tricky. The thing is that this has to be dynamic. So you can have a certain level of standard, this is okay, but tomorrow we'll have a bit less, a bit more. Give the example of Italy. So in Italy, a few months ago, ChatGPT was blocked for one specific. I can't remember exactly what it was, but they blocked it. When I got there, 2 weeks later, I was doing a presentation on ChatGPT. I was very worried, but they blocked it. So this goes up and down, and this is okay because there's a reason to block it, and there's a reason not to block it, same with standards. So you go with the flow, and at some point in time, you'll find a balance. But without actually trying to increase or decrease the levels of standards that you have, you will always end up in the extremes, and that's not helpful for anyone. So to actually give it a try, an experiment, is a good thing. Let me just do a second comment I wasn't expecting, but you were mentioning security, DNSSEC. Another thing that will come into play soon, maybe not today, but 2 years ago, this was very trending, and then AI came along, all of this disappeared, which is quantum. Quantum, and especially quantum security, will be something that we will discuss in the next few years in events such as this, because it is something that nowadays people are understanding the need and the advantages. It's not there yet, technology is not there yet, but it will be. So hopefully next year we'll talk about that some more as well.
Thank you.
We have a working group wanted to start work on that. So
Yeah, yeah, no, you're right. You're right on. If we only solve today, so the problems of today, then we'll have new problems to deal with tomorrow.
otherwise, we will be out of work, Maarten.
Yeah, and I see from and please, those in the Zoom room, feel very free to raise your hand and not only share in the chat, but also live, because the people in the room here don't see the chat.
Now, Martin, I'm concerned about the time, and I see Sarah is
Yeah, Sarah.
Wishing to intervene now.
Sarah, please.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Sarah Kiden. I am a technologist, but I'm based in a design school. And after listening to all the conversations, I think perhaps this conversation really needs to happen more on the product design side, because we are having it at the policy side, at the regulation side, and we're not really discussing this at design level. So being part of a design school for 4 years, I've noticed that these conversations are not happening in product design, and yet these are the people who at the end of the day are going to build your product, and yet they don't understand the concepts. So in my work, I've been looking at the 5-stage design thinking process and how you can embed some of these values into a design process. For example, at the empathize phase, where you're trying to research your users' needs, immerse yourself in their environment, I think the stage should be broader than what it is right now. I think designers need to understand the policy environment. They need to understand the laws and of the geographies and jurisdictions they operate in. So, for example, the GDPR or any child online privacy protection regulations and things like that, which is not happening. And I think if you think about it at that level, so you're empathizing, you're thinking about the existing policies, you can see the gaps and you can see what's missing and how to bring it into your product. And then for the define and the ideate phase, where you're stating your users' needs, you're challenging your assumptions, you're trying to brainstorm, I think there is an opportunity for you to define your values at that level. So you can say, for example, privacy is important, openness is important, safety and integrity, and then think about how to actually implement that in a design process. So, for example, would it be a button that someone will press? Is it some sort of trust mark that people can, see and know that they trust it, just like it happens in other fields? And at the prototype phase, also, there's an opportunity for designers, which I think they're not doing at the moment. I think it's important for them to be open and transparent, speak in a language that people understand. I think we all know that product policies are very vague, so we don't even understand what they mean. They are really written in legal speak. So maybe it's an opportunity for us to craft the product policy at the same time as you're crafting the product. Because what happens is you design the product and then write the product policy and then put it into the market where it sits in a place with different jurisdictions. So there's an opportunity for people to work at this phase. And I think designers also should be, open. They should be honest. They should tell a user what the outcomes are. So don't tell them accept or reject. Like, what will happen if I accept this consent? What will happen if I consent? What will happen if I don't consent? And things like that. And I think that's some of the contributions I'd like to put in from a user perspective, but also from a product design perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very, very well said. I see people in the room nodding with their heads in agreement. You don't see that, but it is. Very much appreciated. Wout, you wanted to comment on this?
Yes, Wout Natris.
And then we go to Jonathan Cave.
Thank you for the comments. Just advocate a session tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock, which will be on education and skills and tertiary schooling. But we have written the report last year, and I will not go through it here, but we came up with some recommendations, and we are finding a way forward and to find the funding for the way forward. And the concept that we've came up with is to create a hub and later perhaps regional hubs where all involved come together. So experts from academia, from students, from industry, from governments, and start discussing how this skill gap can be closed, because we're discussing it for about 25 years at this moment. And apparently they're still educating the 20th century instead of the 21st, to exaggerate a little. But perhaps that is a way to come up with an action plan that different countries can actually start to deploy. So that's what we're going to discuss tomorrow as a first launch, and at the IGF hopefully be able to put that into work. So that's the next phase. So be welcome to join the discussion tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Thanks.
And that just illustrates another reason why it's so good to not just have a single focused dynamic coalition here, but to work together. So thanks for that. Jonathan, please.
Okay, I just wanted very briefly to comment on a point that Sarah raised, which I think is a very interesting one. At the Turing Institute, we've been working quite hard on the issue of ethics for AI and AI design processes. And one of the things that I find in my role scrutinizing Turing research projects is that the separation of layers in the human value chain between designers who think like engineers or think like marketers, and government people whose instinct is to regulate, and platform or solution providers whose instinct is blah, blah, blah. You understand the main point, is that each one of them, to do their job, needs to have an understanding of the perspective of what the others do. One of the things we've learned from, for example, the attention targeting algorithms of social media is that the responses of people to being targeted in that way are things for which it would be possible to anticipate them, but the information of that needed to do that, to know how they would respond, is not, for reasons like GDPR, but also reasons of not wishing to take on liability, is not available to the people who make the decisions. And so this chopping up of things, which worked for less sophisticated technology, creates, I think, inappropriate divisions and a kind of multi-stakeholderism, perhaps outside a frame in which legal liability or profit and so on are the big lumps on the table, might be a necessary thing. Because to get engineers, well, I mean, the point was made earlier about the duty of care thinking and regulation. And the duty of care means paying attention. It means having a conversation. It doesn't mean doing your job in a way that maximizes profit or minimizes liability, or even that lets you look at yourself in the mirror in the morning. So I think that the whole architecture of governance here may need to be opened up and rethought. And then the final comment is on the evolution of norms that I think Andre referred to, which is that there are mechanisms or dynamics in the way in which conventions and norms evolve among interacting populations. These don't always result in good outcomes. They don't always converge. And so I think that some level of complexity thinking or systems thinking may be necessary, along with some kind of sandboxing or natural experiment to find out just what this brave new world looks like. Okay, that's it. Thanks a lot to particularly to Andre and Sarah for those comments.
Yes, thanks a lot. The clock is approaching the end of the session. Any final remarks before I'll try to wrap it up?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Martin. It's Olivier speaking. So again, an incredible set of views and a very wide-ranging discussion that we've had. I was looking at the agenda again that you and I had worked on, and one thing that we have not managed to cover again is the one on the climatic impact of not only IoT, but of the internet, IoT, and the AI systems, and whether we can have a positive or a negative impact or both the end, or a mix between the two. And that clearly is going to be a discussion in itself. So maybe we need to have this for the future as a future discussion, because again, it's all interrelated together, and we can't just look at it from a single perspective.
Yeah, so we'll hope to have that in Brisbane at the end of August as well, that discussion. About final remarks from your side?
I think I said all I wanted to say.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you, Thomas.
Yes, just one word. What you say? I mean, everything has an impact, and the impact is always good and bad. If you look at the engines, they have enabled us to fight against hunger and produce better goods. They have enabled us to move distances faster across the ocean. We even made it to the moon, but we wouldn't have had millions of people killed in 2 world wars if we didn't have engines in tanks, in airplanes, and so on. And we wouldn't have the climate problem that we are having increasingly without the engine. So it is what you do with it. And we are still at the beginning of the, let's say, digital transformation. I would dare to say so. Our future generations will have some work to do.
Well, you're here. Alessandro, a last remark. And
very briefly. Thank you. I think this session has come out in an outstanding way. Congratulations, Martin, Olivier, for organizing it, and every speaker and participant. To the point of energy and environment, just make sure that you have the right background lines, that you're not testing against something that didn't exist. The question is how much more energy it would take to share all the video we share these days, for example, by people having to drive to a Blockbusters or to go to a movie house. Certainly that would be unimaginable. And again, it's not only the internet, it's people, it's machines, it's things that people do. They may work better intentionally, that means beyond the intentions of the makers, but let's not give agency only to the internet for things to blame or for success, but look at both parts of the equation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate the session, also the contribution, your interest and attention here in the room and in the Zoom room. Quick takeaways, and thanks also for bringing the perspectives of your research, of your AI work, and of course of the core internet values work. What I heard also from AI is that what still remains true is basically this transparency and assigning of liability wherever you come. We need that clarity for people to take their responsibility. Duty of care is key, but if you can get away with it, people are less likely to take that responsibility seriously than if they can't get away with it because it's transparent and there's a clear assignment of liability. Wout also brought in the point very clear. Many governments talk about it, yet their policies that they even talk about in public, which are not always coded in laws yet, but they don't translate that yet in procurement. And government taking a direction and leading by procurement can be a very powerful tool. So I think that's a very clear remark.
2 o'clock this afternoon.
2 o'clock this afternoon. Other things that came up is it's dynamic. Let's not try to solve the problems of today. Let's think ahead a little bit about where the future goes. So when we take that into account, Sarah, thanks also for bringing in the design aspect. What we see, for instance, in adoption of IP version 6 over time, it was much more difficult 20 years ago because the electronic tools weren't able to deal with it yet. But these machines get replaced over time and get better. So by doing it by design, we gradually change towards an environment where we will be better able to deal with it too. Education key was mentioned several times. And I think a good remark was also, so where do we go for the right information? Establishing of sources of truth, platforms where you truly come together. So with all that, I think we've progressed and we'll take this along to the next meetings. We haven't discussed everything, and even by the time of the IGF, we won't be done with everything, I'm sure, but we are making progress, we're getting insights, and this is what we're trying to do here together. So thank you all for attending, really appreciate it. And the next meeting of the DC IoT would be in Brisbane, and the 30th, 29th, 30th, 31st of August. also possible to participate online. And we'll, in the meanwhile, keep things up via the list as well.
And there'll be another joint meeting with the core internet values. So really looking forward to it.
Appreciation is appreciated. So thank you all.
Thank you.